Good morning to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning. As we gather in this our very sacred and special place where we hear from the Lord and draw close to him, today I want to welcome those of you who gather with us, that this is not your church home, but you are warmly wanted and welcome here at Alfred Street Baptist Church. We thank God for our very special guests who gather with us. If you are not a member of Alfred Street but enjoy being in this place and don't mind identifying yourself with all of our guests, wave a hand. We just want to welcome you. Would you help me welcome all of our guests who gather with us on today? Welcome. We welcome you to this place where we believe that to grow in faith, we also must grow in our intellect, our understanding, and our intelligence. I've said multiple times that one of my goals in ministry is to pastor and to be among the most biblically astute, globally aware, and socially conscious group of Christians that the Lord has ever shaped and crafted. And to do that at times means that we must stretch our mind. Dr. Dyson, I heard a great quote yesterday that I want to pass on to someone. Any idea you have is dangerous if it's the only one you have. And it's very important at times to be able to stretch your mind and hear and think and see things from perspectives that aren't always comfortable and aren't always traditional and aren't always ingrained with your own lifestyle, your own way of thinking and believing. And we gather in this place to stretch and grow. We do it sermonically, and we also do it through study. And I am blessed today to be present to share with my good friend and my brother beloved, the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who has been with us on multiple occasions, and we just enjoy the way God uses him through truth and humor and honesty to broaden our perspectives. And you may not think what he thinks, but that's not his job. His job is just to make sure you're thinking. And so we welcome him into this place on today. I do need to give one note of caveat. Dr. Dyson is a chronic liar when it comes to Beyonce, so would you please don't listen to a word he has to say about me and my relationship with Beyonce. We are glad and excited to be here today. Would you join with me in a word of prayer, and then we prepare ourselves for what God is going to speak. Lord, how we bless you for another beautiful day that you've given to us, a day that you call us to be more than we were yesterday, to share your love more than we did last time, and to understand you in ways we didn't before the sun set on last night. So here we gather to grow, here we gather to think, here we gather to explore the depth of our faith and the relevant, real issues of the world in which we live. We thank you for the vessel of your voice in Michael Eric Dyson, and we pray, oh God, that you would descend deeply within him now, that he might share with us, that we might leave this place better, simply because we have more than one idea and thought on our mind. Bless you for this opportunity we have to share. Create a safe space now for us, oh God, to swim in the deep waters of who you are. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior, we do pray. Amen. We have gathered in this series on race and religion to talk about the relevant issues that face our land, from civil rights to justice. And today I look forward to sharing and hearing from Dr. Dyson, especially in reflection over some thoughts around our presidential administration. I don't know what Dr. Dyson is going to say, but I hope State of the Union changed it, because I sure had a change of opinion on my president on Tuesday. I finally saw some swag I was looking for. Amen. You know, I was looking for some, yeah. Because I want them both. That was the quote of the night. Amen. So do me a favor. Would you help me welcome a brother who is free in this place, who we love and adore, whom God has used? Would you put your hands together and welcome the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson to come and share with us?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley. Finally, a Christian minister is in the place. That's extremely important, along with the Reverend Dr. Judy and our other good brothers. What's your full name? Reverend Dr. Spencer. You know, what an honor it is to be here at this great church, made great by your tradition and burnished and brightened by the brilliant young man, now bearded, the John Wall of Christianity right now, the point guard. He's a point guard, dishing and diming and setting it all up. But he's also a great scorer, right, and understands court vision. And it's important to have a young man like that and to grow with him. I know I ain't got to tell y'all that. Thousands of people throng this great institution to hear what God has laid on his heart and mind, but to see his trajectory and to see him literally coming to grips with broadened data that God inputs from a variety of sources is truly remarkable, because that quote he talked about, have an idea, but dadgum, don't have that as the only idea you got, is extremely important. Sounds good when you say it, but it hurts to grow. You get defensive first. You know, it's like the 5 stages of dying. It's like the 5 stages of coming to grips with an idea. First, you just deny it. You reject it, you repudiate it. Then you say, well, maybe some of it might be, but not me. Then you have an existential revelation that, all right, might be about me. And then at the end, it was meant especially for me. But that's a process, right? That's a process that God grapples with us through. So I'm honored to always come here and to be here at this great church and to have this opportunity. And I'm so sorry that Dr. Wesley has, like Peter, renounced the great queen. I had a message for him from her, but I guess I'll spare him since he don't know her. Maybe somebody else in the church who know Queen B, who woke up like this, flawless, might want to receive that message. But it's such a great honor here to talk about these ideas. And I was talking to Dr. Judy on the way up, teaching as she does, and she was telling me about the stuff she was teaching in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament about dreams using different sources. And it's always good to have a creative teacher like her in the presence. I'm always impressed when scholars actually believe and go to church. It's a big thing. And then to have the hip-hop contingent with young Reverend William is beautiful, because I feel like an old man out here quoting hip-hop, you know, but you got to keep up with hip-hop. It changes so fast. Y'all got that new Joey. You know, there's a lot of new stuff out by Lupe and a lot of other people. I try to keep up with it so I can hear what's going on in this culture. Now, this morning, what I want to do, and I must admit, Dr. Wesley, hearing the president evoke a strain of swag, right? It's a strain of it. Like he said, finally, because you got 2 years left, dog, and you got to figure at some point, you got to come on out. You know, don't be scared. Because they've been hammering this brother since he been up in there, right? They've been, and if you don't, you know, I tell white brothers and sisters, if you don't like Obama, ain't a Negro been made you gonna really dig. It ain't gonna happen. Because he a nice dude. And everybody ain't nice like that. But it has some destructive and deleterious consequences to us when it becomes the only paradigm for how appropriate black masculinity should respond in the face of opposition. That's one, not the only, the notion that Dr. Wesley began with. That's one idea. It ain't the only one. Now, we got to give it up to him. He had an idea that no black person in history has ever successfully held. I will be president of the greatest empire in the history of the world. You got to give, that's swag right there. Just, right? Just to think you can do it and then follow through with it. So the reason you don't listen to a whole bunch of Negroes, because if y'all had knew about it, you would have done it before I got here. You gotta give him love on that. Howsoever, as James Brown would say. We do have a tradition. Ain't no one journey greater than the tradition that produces the journey. And that's where we got it twisted. So what I want to do is start with, in this first part, a kind of historic, brief genealogy, understanding of, development of what black leadership was about and what we were doing when we produced black leaders. Then secondly, I want to talk about our specific relationship to the White House, what black leaders have done, in particular in their relationship to past presidents. Then I want to talk about what happens when we elect a black president, and before that, our quest for the White House as a symbol of black political power. Then fourthly, I want to talk about what happens when we elect a black president. And then fifthly, how we come to a judicious criticism of him. I know that gets black folk real tight. You know, be criticizing Obama, right? I remember I was on TV, and in the earlier days when I was trying to provoke this White House, because I had been a surrogate, I was a surrogate twice, to put my prejudice right on the table. I was for the man. I was in crack houses in Florida, and then I went out and became a surrogate for the president. Now, I don't want y'all to think I was in the crack house engaging any crack. I'm saying I was telling them, you can vote, you can get out of this misery, you can have a representative in the White House who hears you. So I did that twice. Loved the man, understood him, knew him since, what, 92, when we were on a panel, me, him, and Cheryl Lee Ralph at McDonald University, a member at Trinity with him. So I've seen his development and growth in a remarkable young man. So I ain't no hater. But at the same time, we have to come to grips with what he represents to us and how we think insightfully about that. And that means we have to entertain ideas of how we hold him accountable. Now, just because you love somebody don't mean you don't hold them accountable, right? Oh, I'm married to my wife. I've never criticized her in 50 years. Well, that might be true, but what I'm saying, she can criticize you, but you on her, that's different. That's different, dog. Yes, honey. No, honey. Thank you, dear. You're sure? Absolutely. Take it all. Yes. It's great. It's great. That is healthy. That is a healthy response. But her on you, that's different. Get your teeth cleaned, pick your afro, and take that crud between your toes out. You know, but when you love somebody, that don't mean you just uncritically adore and celebrate them. You got to engage them. I love my children, therefore I never discipline them. I mean, in terms of talking to them, not beating them. So I'll start then by talking about the historic legacy that we have been imbued with. Because black leadership from the very beginning was about airing the grievances of black America to the broader world and to interpret the interests, goals, and aspirations of black people. Black leadership's purpose was to represent the deep desires and profound wishes of African people in America to a broader constituency, to represent the goals and dreams of black people to a broader populace. In the context of American democracy, black leaders have emerged to make moral complaint against the ethical limits of democratic culture. Moral complaint against the ethical limits of democratic culture. Democracy, ostensibly, supposedly, was about the representation of the will of the people as manifest in voting and having the ability to shape the democracy in which they participated. because we were denied that privilege, had to have a whole bunch of amendments come to the Constitution, had to challenge the basis of American society. That's why we saw again in Selma the strategies that were being deployed by black leaders to try to close the gap between the ideal of American democracy and the practice of American democracy on the other hand. So black leadership emerged as the attempt to air the black grievance of the denial of opportunity that should have been ours as a result of participating in democracy. Now, we know when the founding fathers came along, they ain't really had us in mind, right? And we could go through a whole bunch of stuff technically and legally and philosophically. We could talk about John Locke and the conception of individual liberalism, where the ownership of property was the predicate for determining citizenship. You ain't had no property, you couldn't own it. That means you had to be a white man who owned property in order to be recognized as a citizen. When you were property yourself, that's hard. So chattel slavery, which reduced black persona, black identity, to its function and utility in American capitalism and in the machinery of the support of American democracy, couldn't participate in it, but we could show enough support it. We were the intellectual labor, we were the physical labor, we were the behemoth brutes upon whose backs slavery rested. Through our loins, the power of slavery was extended, so we were reduced to property, we were denied legitimate authority as human beings, and we were the basis for the expansion of the opportunity of white brothers and sisters in America. That'd be funny when we get called lazy. When we worked a whole long time with no kind of wage, for free, to build all this up, and then now we get denied equal access to it. So black leadership then emerges out of the context historically of the reign of white supremacy. Now, what we mean by white supremacy ain't individual white brothers and sisters and calling your names and all that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the conscious or unconscious belief in the inherent superiority or inferiority of one group of people. And as a result of that, the refusal to recognize the ability of black people to be seen as completely and totally invested with the Spirit of God as human beings, and to be denied access to our humanity, and to be seen in a subordinate sense to the dominant American identity. We were part of it only because we were brought in. We weren't seen as human beings who were deserving of respect. We were seen as, eventually within the context of arguments in the Constitution, 3/5 human. Now, that was not only a 3/5 human in terms of what's going on, in terms of how we would be counted in the broader society, it was also about the way in which, as American citizens, we were not seen as totally proficient in citizenship virtues. And beyond that, we were not seen as fully human. So when you talk about Mike Brown, when you talk about Eric Garner, I can't breathe, or why are you shooting me, and the dehumanization of black people, that began a long time ago. So the dehumanization of black people, the ownership of property as the predicate for citizenship, the extension of the virtue of being seen as an American citizen to a very few meant that from the very beginning, black people's lives were deeply and profoundly shaped by the political circumstances of America, which is why black leadership responded directly to those limitations. How is it that in American democracy we're denied access to legitimate freedoms that are guaranteed by those who are covered under its own arc? And so black leadership aired grievances. Black people said, we belong, we deserve, we should have, we ought to be part of this American society that we have helped build. So black leadership from the very beginning was trained on the political limitations that were imposed arbitrarily on African people in America. And a lot of those leaders happened to be clergy people. Why were they clergy people? Because the clergymen and later women had access to high quality education, relatively speaking, right? Now we know even in the broad sweep of human history, the clergy themselves were the ones who were trained and capable of literacy in the Bible, right? Think about the so-called Middle Ages, and then after that, the people who were the intelligentsia were those who were clerics, because clerics had access to literacy, reading and writing and discovering the truths of biblical texts, generating a science of interpretation around texts, text-centered cultures where ideas were mediated through papyrus and mediated through people's engagement with ultimate truths by writing, struggling. And our tradition was relegated to an oral tradition. There were certain conventions that were put in place, how we tried to memorize stuff, how we told stories in a certain way to communicate these ideas. And then, of course, they developed an entire regime of understanding truth. The oral tradition was subordinate to the written tradition, that the oral tradition was not as powerful as the written tradition. That therefore, Negroes were not as smart as white people. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but we ain't got but 2-3 hours. So the thing is that black intelligence was seen as inferior. So you've got the development of suspicion and skepticism of black intelligence along with the denial of black humanity. Never forget those central pillars of the development of white supremacy and American society: the denial of our humanity and the rejection of our intelligence. And we see that going on right now. I mean, Eric Holder, Susan Rice, and Barack Obama have all been attacked as insufficiently intelligent. Now, them some smart black people. I don't care what you think about them, right? The president, undergraduate at Columbia after starting at Occidental College out west, came to Columbia, and then went on to Harvard to get his law degree. Eric Holder, undergraduate Columbia, law school Columbia, Ivy League school. Susan Rice got a PhD, 25, 26 years old, from Oxford. Not in Ohio. That's a good school too. I ain't mad at Oxford in Ohio. I'm just saying, right? A D.Phil, a doctor of philosophy from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. But John McCain said she wasn't smart, but you put Sarah Palin up. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. And then Eric Holder's intelligence questioned by Senator John Cronin. I mean, really? I mean, and Donald Trump questioning Barack Obama? Bruh. It ain't even real. So the suspicion of black intelligence and the repudiation of black humanity are the building blocks of Western culture, white supremacy, because the acknowledgement of black humanity and intelligence, relatively speaking, are recent events in the development of American and Western culture. In other words, recognizing that we are human and intelligent ain't a long tradition in the West, and especially in America. Black leaders then rejected and repudiated that paradigm because they developed an alternative expression of black identity that was rooted in an appreciation for literacy. The quest for literacy, the quest to be educated, has been one of the dominant impulses in black history. We want to be smart. We want to tell the truth. We want to be able to handle books. We want to be able to handle ideas. And literacy was already from the very beginning quite complicated for us. We could never reduce it merely to book sense. It had to be a comprehensive sense of wisdom that allowed us to appropriate knowledge for particular ethical moments and particular ethical purposes. What is your knowledge for? What you getting it for? What you gonna do with it when you got it? And so all of that is the backdrop for black leadership, A, to be examples of black literacy, B, to air black grievances to the broader world because we were historically and illegitimately denied, many of whom were ministers because they had access to high quality education, relatively speaking, and they were able to carry forth and articulate our goals. So people who talk about the church ain't got nothing to do with politics don't know your history of the black church. You just don't. Because from the get-go, we couldn't help but be political. You know, when I look at TV sometime or listen to some of these, my beloved brothers and sisters in the clergy and stuff, and they telling folk to breathe right and do, that's all good. I ain't mad at none of that. Because those disciplines of the spirit, Brother Foster would call them, are extremely important. But the reality is, y'all, is that from the very beginning, our spirituality has been shaped by politics. Amen. Our spirituality has been shaped by politics. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the fundamental structure of black identity and the ways in which black religious identity has always owed a debt to what we were able to do in terms of politics. Why? Because you can't have no spiritual recognition if they burning your church down. You can't have no spiritual recognition if they deny your humanity. You can't have any spiritual recognition if you have no recognition by the state because you're not a legitimate participant in the broader drama and pageantry of American democracy. So it's all related. All this, I'm going to talk about Jesus alone and think about theology and my faith and my relationship to my God is always tied up with being able to do that in a space that you would not be lynched for having the temerity to do it. That's why black folk got kicked out of the white church. We up in the balcony, shout out to the balcony. Negroes couldn't be on the main stage, couldn't sit down with everybody else. Now, y'all going to heaven, but we got to be segregated right here, right? Reminds me of that poem by Deacon Al Hall, one of your members here, about how we going to get together in heaven if we can't even do it right here on earth, right? So for me, when you think about the historical development of black theology was attempting to say, and the black church more broadly was attempting to say, we count too. Black lives matter. That we are so determined to recognize our relationship with God, we're going to lead the church. We're just going to lead the white church. Just get up and get out and start our own. Then we start our own, people saying it's unintelligent, unintelligible, what are Negroes doing? The little stuff they doing is cute on the side, but it ain't got nothing to do with God. Now we got the most thriving, dynamic institution of religion in America. The mainstream churches are dying. Black church is still thriving. The stuff that started in a cubbyhole and in the desire for black people to articulate their own vision of God is now the dominant motif of successful church growing in this country. Now, Southern Baptists doing all right in terms of the broader white church, but black religious experiences, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, right, and the denominations that adhere to a charismatic conception of religious truth, they are doing much better than the rest of the world, at least in this country, because of the dynamic relationship between faith and politics and culture and how our religion is a manifestation of that. Now, I spent all that time saying that because black preachers who came out of that tradition understood that they had an obligation to talk about heaven and earth, about what God wanted and what human beings need on earth. And if you say you love God and yet you don't deal with your neighbor in a certain way, they interpreted that to mean you got to hook us up on this pilgrimage down here. Yeah. Yeah. People talk about being heaven bound but no good on earth, right? All the stuff. And sometimes it was what the psychologists call compensatory. So they love for you to focus on heaven because you ain't going to ask why your light bills are so high. Because you blinded by the light of Jesus. You ain't going to ask why, and I do mean ask. You ain't going to ask why social injustice prevails because you're so consumed with it. Doesn't make a difference. I'm focused on Jesus with a made-up mind, right? They didn't mind you doing that because then that would keep you from understanding the illegitimate political authority they were wielding and the unfair denial of opportunity to you. So you focused on Jesus in heaven in a narrow sense while they messing you over down here on earth. It was a great bargain. But black religion at its best said, no, because I'm concerned about God. I'm concerned about God's creation. And as a result of that, I got to pay attention to the political and social and moral situation and circumstance of black people as the manifestation of my regard for God. The late, great James Washington, great church historian, said some people go to church to love God instead of their neighbor. Yeah, that'll preach right there, you know. The Bible says, how can you love God who you ain't never seen, and you don't love your neighbor who you see every day? Black political leadership air black grievances, repudiate the notion of black unintelligence, argue for black humanity using a religious basis to express the political conception of the common good. All that's going on. Then, black political leadership has been shaped by those historic norms developed in black communities. Black political leadership was always closely tied to the church. Why? Because the church was the center of our community. We didn't just go to church to praise Jesus. We went there to politically organize, meet our mates. Don't be ashamed. You come into church, you just bump into who could be your wife or your husband, etc. So I'm leaving all that alone. That ain't my church. I don't know what you're doing. So the church becomes a conduit and a filter for the ambitions of the black community at large. So we have never had a church that was immune to political circumstance. So we did all the stuff in the church: educational learning and authority, social benefit, economic pooling. All of that stuff happened in the church. Black leadership grew out of the church. Black political leadership, a lot of whom were ministers. Henry Highland Garnett, Hiram Revels, on down to Adam Clayton Powell, on down to Bill Gray, on down now to Emmanuel Cleaver. A lot of black ministers, Andrew Young, John Lewis, ministers who got involved in church. Now you see why sexism hurts and hampers us, because if the women could have been allowed to be ministers in their own church that they were leading, right? God doesn't ordain women. I was at a church last year in outside of, I shouldn't say where it is, okay, outside of Dallas. And and I was invited as the, banquet speaker for scholarship. I'm a minister, but I'm also a professor, so it made sense. So I talked about it. I preached a little bit. It was a preacher. Well, no lecture. I was preaching. And the minister got up, an older man, venerable figure, really, really good guy. And he says, Dyson is smart, blah, blah, blah. He went and praised me. He said, however. There it is. That's where the truth is right there. After that, however. Because I had talked about, women's rights and equality. He said, as long as I breathe and I'm the pastor of X, Y, and Z church, women know their place. Wow. I was like, that's like out of a movie. Like, for real? You're doing that in 2014? I could see maybe like 50 years ago or 30 years ago, but like 2014? You on the women know their place tip in a black church where women have never behaved according to etiquette and protocol anyhow? For real? You were on that? So when you think about the legacy of our leadership, black women who have been so central to determining who we are at every level, and even defending black men who are being rejected. This is the sad consequence of sexism, which is the belief in sentiments against women because they're women, or misogyny, which is the hatred of women consciously or unconsciously, or patriarchy, which is the belief that men's lives should provide the paradigm for how we deal with human existence and the distribution of power and resource. So when you look at patriarchy and misogyny and sexism, it is really ultimately destructive of the best understanding we have of the church that has produced us. And it's denied us access to some brilliant leadership. So when you look at all that stuff in aggregate, black people in terms of our leadership understood our ties to the black church, and black political leaders had to pay their due. That's why black political leaders come to church. Now, we know a lot of them just go in there because they need some votes, but they recognize where the power is. So they said, boy, if we can get Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley on board, and we can get his congregation, then, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, you got to always determine who has access and how they get access and what they're saying, and you got to hear people out. The church has become a conduit for the political sensibilities of the black community, not in terms of Democrat versus Republican, but politics in terms of arguments over the substantive distribution of goods and resources to vulnerable communities. That's what politics is. That's why Kanye West stood up and said George Bush doesn't care. He didn't say love. He said care for black people. What he was saying was he don't know George Bush personally. George a nice cat. But political definitions of care are measured by delivering critical resources in a time of crisis to vulnerable populations in ways that help them. Now, remember that definition when it comes to our president. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. It can't be good for them and not good for us. I'm just saying. I know y'all, you're a preacher, you're taught when people don't say amen, that's where you stay. The amen stuff is easy. It's the harumphs and the, I don't know. Oh, that's my assignment. For me, because I'm a paid pest, that's kind of what I do, right? You got to know your role. I mean, I'm not elegant and articulate in the biblical prophetic tradition of a Howard John Wesley, who could preach a better sermon by mistake than most people on purpose. He don't even be meaning to, just throwing out stuff. Just introductory comments. He'd be like, oh my God. That's a gift and a calling and a vocation. It's specific and particular. It resonates within the context of our ears and hearts in particular ways because traditions of interpretation rest upon them. My kind of stuff is about asking the questions of the surrounding flora and fauna, about what it be looking like, and the context within which it operates, what the immoral ecology and the intellectual atmosphere is about. Are we breeding helpful plants that give life and oxygen, or are we breeding things that suck the oxygen of intellectual freedom away, and as a result of that, we begin to perish? So when you look at what's going on, black leadership has always been tied to the black church because we articulate the grievance of black people and tell the truth about black suffering, and politicians had to bear the weight of that. So these politicians, my brothers and sisters, represented us. Our political figures represented us, and those who didn't were punished by us, by not being elected, by being silenced, right? Everybody's got a litmus test. See, now, it doesn't appear to us now when Polish and Italian and Irish politicians were running, they were accountable to the broader society, but they paid homage. They paid due to the communities from which they emerged. They weren't going to diss no Italian community, wasn't going to diss no Polish community, wasn't going to diss no Jewish community because they represented the interests of their people. But there's something about black solidarity that becomes problematic. There's a suspicion of 2 or 3 black people getting together. You know how in the Bible, 2 or 3 gathered in my name? No, dog, we can't do that politically. They are fomenting a revolution. I think they're trying to undercut us, right? That's why black love is a political act too. The most majestic politics of black identity is one black person loving another. That is one of the most profound, what they call in philosophy the locus classicus. It's the center, right? What Howard Thurman called the nerve center. Remember how he said you got to yield the nerve center of your consent to God, right? Dag Hammarskjöld in his book Markings talked about saying yes to eternity, to God, affirming your existence. And so what we are dealing with here then is the attempt of black leaders to express our identities and our ideas in the midst of a culture that was suspicious of our humanity and denied the legitimacy of our intelligence. And we embraced leaders who embraced us. Unquestionably and unapologetically, members of the dominant society. Look at the machines in Chicago, politically speaking, with the dailies. Look at what happened in Boston, Italian and Irish, right? And the communities that were existing, even their subcultures and their counterculture have been romanticized, right? What I mean by counterculture and subculture, I'm talking about within so-called mafia, right? Even the movies glamorized. Was The Godfather, the greatest American movie ever made. Look how they massacred my boys. Right? Y'all, you got to watch The Godfather. It's about respect. It's about family, right? When Sonny is up there doing some crazy stuff, one of his sons, and he's trying to give a lesson to the Frank Sinatra character, he kind of talks to Sonny by talking to the Frank Sinatra character. You spend time with your family? Looking at his son in the back, who's just done some misdeed. Good, because a man who doesn't spend time with his family can never truly be a man. Look at the moral sensibility being argued. In the midst of fratricide, blood spilled in the street, men murdering others in the name of the pursuit of American capital and the accumulation of wealth and politics, in the midst of that comes a lesson about the moral utility of family and domestic unity. Because it's complicated like that, but we don't listen to some. But what we do, the young prophets we have in hip hop, we just ignore them. Nah, there's a bunch of cussing and obscenity. Yes, you got to get past some of that. Okay, a lot of it. Let's be real. Don't play that on Sunday morning in church. That's not the appropriate place. But you got to hear the same agony. Now all my teachers couldn't reach me, and my mama couldn't beat me hard enough to match the pain of my pop not seeing me. So with that disdain in my membrane, got on my blank game, forget the world, my defense came. You got to hear the agony, but also the moral and ethical sensibility that is implanted there. So even in their counterculture, my point is, they represented their interests in certain powerful ways that were heard by the broader community. So when black people come along, though, black unity is always a threat to dominant white supremacist culture. Why? Because it is seen as undermining the ability of white people to control the minds and the bodies of black people. Black political unity was always discouraged because in the face of black solidarity, there was not much we could not accomplish. Hence, the deep desire for that unity in contrast to the manifest inability of black people to sustain it. We got all kind of, we multiply by dividing. It's a strange mathematics, right? I don't like your church, I'll leave and start my own. I ain't mad. There's something about the democratic urge there that's powerful, but there's also something about the splintering of black identity and the lack of a holistic conception of unity. Now, I don't think we should, look, me and Clarence Thomas ain't gonna never agree on nothing. That don't mean he ain't black. He a black man. I ain't got to deny his blackness. You black, you just a black fool. Now, I'm not saying he is. I could disagree with you. I'm not calling Clarence Thomas a black fool. What I'm saying, I'm not calling him a black, that's not what I meant to say. Right? Somebody disagree with me. I've been called a black fool. Let's use me as an example. You black fool. You got book smart, but you're dumb. Black people disagree with you and beat you up. So that don't mean I ain't black because I disagree with you. But I disagree with your understanding of blackness and what its moral utility is in the public square. So we have disagreements based on that, because black folk ain't never agree. You got the Urban League, which is about the adjustment to the urban culture of black people in the early part of the 20th century. You got the NAACP, which grew out of the anti-lynching movement of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was denied legitimate access as a leader because she was a woman, a prophetic one at that. With W.E.B. Du Bois, who was beefing with Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had the major, massive movement of black people in the 20th century, and then they found him on some technicality and deported him. First it was Marcus Garvey, then Slick Rick. What is this world coming to? Okay. Deport these black folk like that. Bring Slick Rick back. Uncle Rick, right? Oh my God. Obama's deported more people than any president in the history of this nation. The deporter-in-chief. I'm just building up. That's a little foreshadowing. I ain't going to talk about it yet. Deported more people than any president in the history of this nation. The cost of blackness is sometimes to prove to whiteness that you will not undermine its authority. Therefore, you're harder on your own than even the white people are. And the Bible said the people began to murmur. So for our purposes here, black leadership had to tell the truth about black suffering and the legitimate access to black power, that black people should have. Rooted in the church, all ethnic communities defend their own. Black unity was seen as problematic because it challenged the authority of dominant white culture. And then black politics began to air the grievances of black people and represent our interests before the common good. Involved in that were black leaders who had a critical relationship to the president when they could get in. You remember Booker T. Washington was invited by Theodore Roosevelt for a meal at the White House? That was huge and very controversial. What did Roosevelt say afterward? Oh, he didn't eat at the White House and the Oval Office. He didn't touch the silverware. In other words, he ain't contaminating the place. Used to be happening when Negroes got into the water in the 1950s and 60s, and they would pour bleach in the pool to try to tell the white patrons that the Negroes would not contaminate the place. Right? This ain't 150 years ago. We're talking about the 1950s and 60s. So Booker T. Washington goes to the White House, and Booker T. Washington, as you know, was an accommodationist, right? Now, he was a complicated man. Up from Slavery, his autobiographical narrative, what some scholars have called autocryography, black people crying forth, giving vent to the rage and also desperation to be counted as human. So Booker T. Washington, in slavery, ex-slave, moves up the ladder, becomes the most powerful black leader in America. And what's his message? Black folks should lay down your pails where they are, be an agrarian people, be entrepreneurial, be business-minded, all of which is good. But don't be axing too much of the dominant white culture. Accommodate them. They don't like you, you ain't got to like them. Start your own stuff, don't be involved. That's the charitable interpretation. The more harsh interpretation would be that Mr. Washington surrendered the legitimacy of black desires for upward mobility by means of educational achievement. Along comes William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, the first black to get a PhD from Harvard. 1896, he's writing about the slave trade. 1903, his collection of essays gathered from The Nation and from the Atlantic Monthly into a book termed The Souls of Black Folk. If you ain't read it, read it. It's a great book still. The Poetry and Prophecy, each chapter with an epigraph derived from a sorrow song, a slave song, a spiritual, because he's trying to narrate the intense preoccupation with black spiritual mobility in the midst of a culture that would demobilize us, keep us from moving, decenter us, not make us agents of our own destiny, and deracinate us, just a big word, to undermine the legitimacy of our racial roots. He says one ever feels his two-ness, an American and a Negro. Two warring ideas, two unreconciled thoughts, locked in one body, whose, quote, dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Double consciousness. Negro American, black person, United States citizen. I'm caught betwixt and between. And so this is why many Americans doubted black citizenship and the legitimacy of black patriotism, because we tended to criticize America because they tended to hurt and harm us and oppress us. So we didn't have that, oh my God, it's so great. Frederick Douglass said, what to the Negro is July 4th? Don't mean nothing to us, a day to barbecue. Okay, he didn't say that part, I'm just saying that's what. Booker T. Washington, accommodationist. Frederick Douglass, another ex-slave, wrote 3 autobiographical narratives. Notice the tight tie between literacy and leadership, between the quest for expressions articulately on page of black experiences and the projection of black identity and aspiration in the broader democratic culture. Notice the relationship between literacy and leadership. Can't be a leader if you ain't really that smart. And trying to express black people's ideas in a dominant culture where you had to interpret them. So Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest black intellectual, period, and then Frederick Douglass, who wrote 3 autobiographical narratives. Frederick Douglass said, it is difficult for us to enslave a literate person, right? Because literacy makes us unacceptable cogs in the machinery of slavery, but it also makes us uncomfortable with being a slave. Reading unfits a child for slavery. Literacy, he says, unfits a child for slavery. George Clinton said the same thing, but differently. Free your mind, and your behind will follow. Right? That's the George Clinton funkadelic. Never learned to swim. Couldn't catch the rhythm of the stroke. Yeah, remember that? That's acceptable. So these leaders are expressing their relationship. Booker T. Washington goes to the White House, representing, supposedly, the interests of black people. Frederick Douglass is putting pressure on Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln wasn't intending to hook Negroes up. Now, I know some black people get upset. Well, don't be acting like Abraham Lincoln had the desire to free Negroes. That's true, but it's the result I'm looking at. I don't care what your intention was, right? Your intention could be whatever. I still got free. I was free. I was free. You know, intention and consequence are 2 different things. My pastor, Dr. Frederick Sampson, a great preacher, like Howard John Wesley, in that tradition. Watch out now. God stands on tiptoe expectancy. That's what he used to say. And he said, a mosquito don't mean no harm. He just wants some blood, but he might give you malaria. So intent doesn't determine consequence. Abraham Lincoln was doing what he was doing, but the result was Negroes got free. So Frederick Douglass was putting pressure on him, and y'all talking about being mad at the Selma movie. Like I said last week, where was Frederick Douglass in the Lincoln movie? Where was he? He was absent, right? We ain't mad. We a little bit we were. Okay, a lot. But what I'm saying is that we always get written out of history. We get wrote out of history, not written. We get wrote out of history, and we get wrote out of the filmic representation. That's why it's important to make our own. That's why Selma is our movie. It's ours. That's our understanding, right? So, and look at what's interesting about the Selma movie, too, before I move on. See, the so-called biggest leaps of interpretation didn't have to do with Lyndon Baines Johnson. Did Coretta Scott King actually say the stuff that was ascribed to her, right? Her interactions with Dr. King is pretty tense. But you know, even if she didn't say it, according to what she said, she might have really said it, right? Martin and I never talked about that. Had a high-level relationship. Oh, okay. Good. I'm glad that's what you told the world. But at the real crib? Let me just go there for a moment. Now, you might be Mr. Civil Rights. People be listening to everything you say. But here, then you interviewed Dr. King. Now, you know he used to smoke. Sorry to break it to you. Don't smoke, young people. But he had every day somebody trying to kill him. We can cut him some slack. You just trying to kill yourself, right? So he says, basically, they're interviewing him on the real tip, 50 years later, right? Well, I went out one night, Corey put me out, and I said, I'm going to get a pack of cigarettes. I looked up, 15 Negroes were following me. I said, I might as well march to Montgomery then. Don't let me be no filmmaker. Oh, Lord. Huh? That's why King said he never listened to Malcolm too much. Can you imagine him doing I Have a Dream speech after listening to Malcolm? I had a dream. I'm mad now. We're going to have to go out here and break some heads up in here today. For shizzle my nizzle. Okay, I'm sorry. That's all right. That's. So black leaders, airing black grievance, putting pressure on the president. Because putting pressure on the president is a black leader's job. Not nasty, not vicious, constructive, right? Engaging. Booker T, not so much, but just showing up in the early 1900s with Theodore Roosevelt, Rough Riding Roosevelt, was enough to cause a national outrage where the presidential office had to issue clarification. Frederick Douglass, pressure on Lincoln. What are you doing about the Negro? Asa Philip Randolph. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Dining with the kitchen cabinet. Mary McLeod Bethune, can't get no reverend in the church, but recognized by the president. Because sometimes the state intervenes in a way ultimately that maybe reflect more of our divine assignment of humanity and meaning to a human being than the church does sometimes. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. Let you know. Right, Henry David Thoreau said, any man more right than his neighbor is a majority of one. So, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, and other Negroes are meeting with FDR, his unofficial shadow cabinet, representing Negro interests. Now, they having dinner at the White House, and they hooking up, and then you know the story Harry Belafonte tells, the great Harry Belafonte. The great Harry Belafonte, right? Says that FDR says, I believe everything you're saying, Miss Bethune and Mr. Randolph. Now go out there and make me do it. What did he mean by that? I can't act if you ain't creating no tension. Where the people go, hey, the president had no choice but to respond. Look at the Negroes going crazy. Or threatening that they would march. The first march on Washington was not articulated by the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was a 20 years later fulfillment of a desire of A. Philip Randolph, who threatened to march on Washington in the 1940s. They finally cut a deal with the White House where they would give Negroes access to the military and the ability of Negroes to get certain kind of employment and jobs. There was always an argument on the part of black leadership to the White House about the necessity of expanding the boundaries of opportunity for black people. Thus, when Martin Luther King Jr., first under Eisenhower, then under Kennedy, then under Johnson, went to the White House. And I say that because a lot of people talk about how many times Al Sharpton been to the White House. Al Sharpton been to the White House. He's selling us out. He's doing that. Well, King went to the White House a whole bunch. And a bunch of people went to the White House a bunch. Well, you ain't no real prophet. Some people, some of my brothers in the academy and the intelligentsia who were haters. I ain't talking about critics now. Critics are people who apply standards of disciplined reflection on particular instances and can find somebody wanting and therefore call them out. That's legitimate. But hating, where you just mad and calling people names, handkerchief heads and Uncle Toms and plantation, just slow down with that. Right? Because today's Uncle Tom is tomorrow's liberator, depending on where you stand. Now, there's some people who have sold us out, pure and simple. We ain't talking about that. That's when it's pretty obvious what you're doing. I'm talking about disagreeing with somebody and getting mad. Al Sharpton done been so far outside the mainstream when he started. With a pompadour? In a tracksuit? Run DMC Reverend? My Adidas. I mean, and with a bullhorn? No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice. Negroes wasn't checking for Al Sharpton, except the people who were victims of police brutality. In New York, looked like he was pretty much of a genius in figuring that was going to be the central problem that Negroes would confront. But he was outside. If you want somebody outside the system, he was outside the system. Right? Tawana Brawley accusing prosecutors of rape and so, I mean, you don't get no more anti-authoritarian than that. Jesse Jackson had the advantage, in scare quotes, of the great prophet Dr. King surrendering his life. Jesse Jackson has leeway, steps into the spot, got sanctioned by SCLC, got suspended for 90 days, 60 days, and when he came back, started his own thing, became the central leader for 40 years of African-American culture till the emergence and rise of Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton didn't have the advantage of the leader before him having been mercilessly snatched away, so he had to kill himself. He murdered his former image. Look at him now, physically. Right? He ain't half the man he used to be. But more of a leader than he's ever been. Man, if I were Howard John Wesley, I might could preach that right there. He had to murder himself. He had to assassinate the image that prevailed. And in doing that, went from track suits to Brooke Brothers suits. Still got the coif, but it's more disciplined now. I dare you to put a silhouette of Al Sharpton against George Washington. Same thing. So he went retro. He went founding fathers perm. Right? And I'll pick up in the second part of this lecture about different kinds of prophets. Because the problem is we don't understand there are central prophets and peripheral prophets. Prophets who help negotiate governmental business and prophets who challenge the political authority of the dominant society when we pick up after the 15-minute break. All right? Thank y'all.